It is a little after midnight on the 25th of July, 1943, and the sky above Hamburg has gone mad. Down on the ground, in a concrete bunker, built to track death as it approaches, a German radar operator stares at his screen and cannot believe what he is seeing. Moments ago, the display showed a handful of clean, distinct blips, the signature of incoming British bombers, each one trackable, each one a target for the guns and the night fighters waiting above the city. Now the screen has dissolved into static chaos. Hundreds of echoes bloom across the display, then thousands, spreading and multiplying, until the operator can no longer tell an aircraft from empty air. Somewhere above Hamburg, 791 Avro Lancasters and Halifaxes are converging on the city, and the radar that is supposed to guide the guns to meet them has simply stopped working, not been destroyed, not been outrun, blinded. 30,000 feet below the bomber stream, searchlight crews swing their beams across empty sky, chasing echoes that do not exist. Anti-aircraft batteries fire into darkness, their shells bursting harmlessly among clouds that give off no engine noise and carry no crew. Night fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe, trained for years to be guided onto their targets by ground controllers reading precise radar plots, sit in their cockpits listening to controllers who have nothing coherent left to tell them. The system that had made the skies over Germany a killing ground for British aircrew for the better part of 2 years has, in the space of a few minutes, become useless. The cause of all this confusion is not a new aircraft, not a new bomb, and not a new weapon in any conventional sense. It is falling from the bomb bays of the Lancasters in bundles no heavier than a bag of sugar, tumbling end over end through the freezing air, catching the moonlight as thin strips of foil-backed paper. Each strip is about the length of a school ruler and no wider than a finger. Millions of them are now drifting down over the Elbe, and together they are doing something that no amount of armor plating or evasive flying had managed before. They are making 700 bombers invisible to the machines built specifically to find them. The codename for this deception was Window. It would go on to save the lives of thousands of aircrew, reshape the balance of the night bombing war, and become the ancestor of a countermeasure still carried by military aircraft flying today. This is the story of how a handful of scientists in a requisitioned seaside town worked out that the simplest possible object, a strip of foil cut to precisely the right length, could make the most sophisticated detection technology of the age see nothing but ghosts. To understand why Window mattered so much, it helps to understand exactly how badly Bomber Command needed it. By the winter of 1942, RAF Bomber Command had committed itself to a strategy of sustained night bombing against German industrial cities, sending hundreds of aircraft at a time deep into hostile airspace under cover of darkness. The logic was sound in theory. Darkness offered protection that daylight could never provide, since German day fighters had already inflicted catastrophic losses on unescorted daylight raids. But the Luftwaffe had spent the intervening years building something that made darkness far less forgiving than it first appeared. A continuous belt of ground-controlled radar stations stretching from Denmark down through the Low Countries, known to the Allies as the Kammhuber Line, after the Luftwaffe general who devised it. The system worked with a grim mechanical precision. Freya early warning radars would detect an approaching bomber stream from up to 160 kilometers away. Closer to the coast, paired Würzburg radars, dish-shaped sets accurate to within a few dozen meters, would each lock onto a single aircraft, one tracking the bomber and the other tracking a German night fighter, as a ground controller talked the fighter pilot onto his target, using nothing more than a radio link and a grease pencil marking positions on a plotting table. Each defended sector, nicknamed a Himmelbett, or four-poster bed after the box-like shape it made on the map, could handle only one interception at a time. But the Germans had built dozens of them, forming an unbroken chain that any bomber stream had to cross twice, once going in and once coming home. The results were punishing. Loss rates for bomber command crews climbed through 1942 and into 1943, with individual raids sometimes seeing 4, 5, even 6% of aircraft failing to return. That statistic sounds almost survivable until it is set against the maths of a bombing campaign that required each crew to complete around 30 operations to finish a tour. At a 5% loss rate per raid, the arithmetic of survival became brutal, and aircrew knew it. Many did not expect to live to see the end of their tour, and a horrifying number did not. The Battle of the Ruhr, fought through the spring and early summer of 1943, saw some of the heaviest losses of the entire bombing campaign, with certain nights costing Bomber Command dozens of aircraft and hundreds of men in a single operation. British scientists and airmen alike understood that the problem was not courage, nor aircraft performance, nor bomb tonnage. It was radar. As long as the Kammhuber Line could see the bombers coming, no amount of bravery in the cockpit would meaningfully reduce the losses. What Bomber Command needed was not a better bomber. It needed a way to make the existing bombers disappear from German screens entirely. And by the middle of the war, it was becoming clear that such a thing might actually be possible. The answer had, in fact, been sitting in a drawer for more than a year before anyone was allowed to use it. As early as 1937, a British radar researcher named Gerald Touch, working alongside the radar pioneer Robert Watson Watt, had wondered aloud whether lengths of wire released into the air might overwhelm a radar receiver with false signals. The physicist R.V. Jones, one of the great scientific minds of Britain's secret war, had independently suggested that falling strips of metal foil could do something similar. But it was not until early 1942, at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, or TRE, based first at Swanage on the Dorset coast and later at Malvern in Worcestershire, that the idea was properly developed into a working technique, largely through the work of a Welsh physicist named Joan Curran. Curran, who had studied at Cambridge and already worked on the development of the proximity fuse earlier in the war, was assigned to TRE's countermeasures group, working in a laboratory adjoining the one where her husband Sam Curran researched centimetric radar. Her task was deceptively simple to describe and fiendishly difficult to perfect. Find a way to generate false echoes on German radar screens using material that could be mass-produced cheaply and dropped from an aircraft in flight. She experimented with lengths of suspended wire and with large printed sheets. One early proposal even suggested combining the countermeasure with propaganda leaflets, killing two birds with one falling stone. In the end, none of the elaborate solutions worked as well as the crudest one. The physics behind window is genuinely elegant, and it rewards a moment of explanation because it is the kind of idea that seems obvious only after someone else has already had it. A radar set works by sending out a pulse of radio energy at a specific wavelength and listening for the tiny fraction of that energy which bounces back off a solid object, in this case an aircraft. Curran's insight, refined through painstaking trial and error, was that a strip of metal cut to exactly half the wavelength of the enemy radar signal will resonate with that signal, absorbing and re-radiating the radio energy far more strongly than its tiny size would suggest. In much the same way, a wine glass will hum in sympathy with a particular musical note. Cut correctly, a scrap of foil weighing next to nothing could throw back a radar echo comparable to that of an entire aircraft. The German Würzburg radars, the backbone of the Kammhuber Line's precision tracking, operated at a wavelength of roughly 50 centimeters. Curran's team settled on strips measuring 27 centimeters long and 2 centimeters wide, cut from black paper, backed with a thin layer of aluminium foil, chosen for a wavelength that would resonate powerfully against exactly that frequency. A single strip was almost weightless, but bundled together into packets of around a pound in weight, roughly the heft of a bag of flour, and released from an aircraft's flare chute at a steady rate, often timed by aircrew with a stopwatch at 1 bundle per minute. The strips would tumble and scatter through the slipstream, forming a slowly drifting cloud that could stretch for kilometers and linger in the air for the better part of an hour. To a Würzburg operator on the ground, that cloud looked exactly like a solid mass of aircraft, indistinguishable from the real bomber stream hidden somewhere inside it. Manufacturing the strips was almost comically low-tech for a weapon that would reshape an entire theater of the air war. Production was farmed out to paper and printing firms across Britain, cutting foil-backed paper into precise strips by the hundreds of millions, packing them into simple paper bundles, and shipping them to bomber stations to be loaded into aircraft alongside the bombs. Exact wartime production figures remain difficult to pin down with certainty, much of the paperwork having been kept deliberately vague for security reasons even at the time. But by the height of the bombing campaign, RAF stations were consuming staggering quantities of the material on a nightly basis, with individual Lancasters sometimes carrying dozens of bundles apiece. What makes the story of Window still more remarkable is that it very nearly never got used at all. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. The technique had been proven and ready since early 1942, but for more than a year, the British War Cabinet refused to authorize its use. The reasoning was not technical, but strategic. Britain's own air defenses, still recovering from the Blitz, depended on very similar radar systems to protect London and other cities from German bombers. The government's chief scientific advisor, Professor Frederick Lindemann, argued forcefully that the moment window strips were dropped over Germany, Luftwaffe intelligence would recover samples within days and reverse engineer an identical countermeasure, potentially unleashing a renewed blitz against British cities that British radar would then be powerless to stop. For over a year, the device that could have been saving bomber command crews sat unused, a solution deliberately withheld from the men who needed it most. It was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, who eventually forced the issue, pointing out that the bulk of German night fighter strength was now committed against Soviet forces in the east, that raids on Britain itself had slowed to a trickle, and that far more British bombers were now flying over Germany than a year before, absorbing losses that window could dramatically reduce. On the 15th of July 1943, the War Cabinet finally agreed that the balance of risk had shifted, and Harris was given permission to use window on an operation of his choosing. He chose Hamburg. Operation Gomorrah, the week-long assault on Hamburg that began on the 24th of July 1943, became Window's baptism of fire, and the results exceeded almost every expectation. On that first night, 791 bombers took part in the raid, and only 12 failed to return, a loss rate under 2% at a time when raids of similar scale had often cost 5 or 6 times that number. German night fighter controllers, reduced to reading screens full of meaningless clutter, could offer almost no useful guidance to their pilots. Radar-directed searchlights swept uselessly across open sky. Anti-aircraft guns, deprived of accurate tracking data, fired blind barrages that struck almost nothing. Accounts from German ground crews describe a night of near-total confusion, controllers shouting contradictory instructions, and fighter pilots abandoning their radar sets entirely to search visually by the light of fires already burning below. The device would go on to serve other purposes far beyond simple protection. Nearly a year later, in the days before the Normandy landings, Window played a starring role in Operation Taxable, in which Lancasters of 617 Squadron, the famous Dambusters, flew in tightly choreographed patterns, dropping precisely timed bundles of foil to simulate an entire invasion fleet crossing the channel toward Pas-de-Calais, far from the actual landing beaches. German radar operators watching the Phantom convoy crawl across their screens had no way of knowing it was built entirely from falling paper and foil. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine that Britain held a permanent monopoly on the idea. German scientists had, in fact, developed an almost identical concept independently under the codename Düppel, named after the Berlin suburb where early tests took place. But Hermann Göring had ordered the research suppressed out of fear that it would eventually be used against German cities, precisely the same reasoning that had delayed the British version. 6 weeks after the Hamburg raid, on the night of the 7th of October 1943, the Luftwaffe finally deployed Düppel of their own, cut into strips roughly 80 centimeters long during raids against London as part of what became known as the Mini Blitz. But by then, the strategic picture had shifted decisively. Britain's night fighter force, equipped with newer centimetric radar sets operating on wavelengths that chaff was less effective against, remained largely able to intercept German raiders despite the countermeasure. And the small scale of the renewed German bombing effort meant Düppel never produced results anywhere close to what Window had achieved over Hamburg. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American researchers, including the astronomer Fred Whipple, working with U.S. Navy engineer Merwin Bly, developed their own version of the technology after the concept was shared with Washington, and equivalent chaff systems were soon integrated into United States Army Air Force's operations as well, though British and American use tended to differ slightly in tactics and packaging, even as the underlying physics remained identical. The true legacy of Window is difficult to state in a single figure, and historians remain appropriately cautious about drawing too neat a line between one countermeasure and an entire campaign's casualty statistics. Other factors, including improved bomber tactics, better electronic jamming systems, and shifts in German fighter strength, all played their part in the changing loss rates of 1943 and 1944. What can be said with confidence is that on the specific night of its debut over Hamburg, Window produced an immediate and measurable collapse in the effectiveness of German ground control defenses, and that its introduction forced the Luftwaffe into a scramble for alternative tactics, most notably the Wildesau, or Wild Boar, method developed by Oberst Hajo Hermann, in which single-seat day fighters were directed visually against bombers illuminated by searchlights and the fires of burning cities below, since ground radar could no longer be trusted to do the job. Beyond the statistics, the psychological effect on German air defense crews should not be underestimated. An entire system built around precision, around the comforting certainty of a dot on a screen representing a real trackable object, had been rendered suddenly and completely unreliable. Operators who had trusted their instruments for years now had to treat every echo with suspicion, and that erosion of confidence rippled through the whole chain of command. Window did not need to destroy German radar to defeat it. It only needed to make the operators doubt what they were seeing, and doubt, once introduced into a system built on split-second decisions, is almost as effective as destruction. Examples of window strips survive today in museum collections, including the International Bomber Command Center in Lincoln, which in 2025 unveiled a permanent memorial to 10 women who made vital contributions during the war, Joan Curran among them, commemorated in an 8-foot steel silhouette, alongside the other so-called modern giants of the RAF's wartime effort. Her contribution went largely unrecognized in her own lifetime. She published none of her wartime research under her own name, gave few interviews about it, and moved on after the war to a different kind of quiet, determined work, co-founding what became Enable Scotland after her own daughter was born with a severe disability. Yet R.V. Jones, one of the most senior scientific figures of Britain's secret war, would later state plainly that in his assessment, Joan Curran's contribution to victory outweighed even that of her husband Sam, who was knighted for his own separate radar work. Joan herself became Lady Curran only in 1970, and her name remained largely absent from popular histories of the war for decades afterward. The device Curran designed did not vanish with the peace. Chaff, as it became universally known after the war, remains standard equipment on military aircraft to this day, now dispensed from small explosive cartridges rather than hand-thrown bundles, still built from foil-coated fibers, cut to resonate against specific radar wavelengths, still capable of blooming into a false cloud within seconds. It has occasionally confused civilian weather radar during modern training exercises, appearing as a sudden, inexplicable storm system on meteorological screens before vanishing as mysteriously as it arrived. A small, faintly comic echo of the confusion it once sowed with lethal seriousness over the skies of Hamburg. Return for a moment to that night above the Elbe, to the German radar operator staring at a screen full of ghosts, to the searchlight crews chasing shadows, to the guns firing at nothing. None of it was magic, and none of it was luck. It was mathematics disguised as scrap paper. It was a wavelength calculated to the centimeter, a shape as unremarkable as a bookmark, dropped by the thousand from bomber after bomber, until an entire national defense network, built at enormous cost over years of careful engineering, simply stopped working. 791 bombers flew to Hamburg on the night of the 24th of July, 1943. 12 did not return. Before Window, A raid of that size might reasonably have expected to lose 4 or 5 times that number, and the aircrew flying it knew the odds as well as anyone. What changed those odds was not armor, and it was not luck. It was a strip of foil, cut to exactly the right length, falling silently through the dark. The Kammhuber Line had taken years to build and represented some of the most advanced technology of its era. Window unraveled it in the time it took a bundle of paper strips to fall from a bomb bay to the ground. That is the strange, understated genius at the heart of this story. The most sophisticated detection system of the Second World War was defeated not by a stronger weapon, but by a piece of foil no more complicated than kitchen wrapping, precisely because somebody had bothered to work out exactly how a wave of radio energy behaves when it meets a shape cut to the right size. Sometimes the deadliest secret of a war is not a bomb at all. Sometimes it is simply the truth about how something as invisible as radio waves can be made with enough precision to lie.